Fontaine started with a bang, which gave me high hopes that the Archon Quest would measure up to the standard set in Sumeru. When the final act was released, the response was fantastic, with many saying it stood out as the best story in Genshin so far, but there were always some who claimed it was overrated. I was extremely busy at the time and wanted to give it the focus it deserved, so I carefully avoided spoilers and saved it until towards the end of the patch. Some will have finished the story a couple of months ago at this point, but for me it's fairly fresh and recent. I played it on stream and loved every minute. A week or two later, I started writing a review, and the moment I started looking closer, I found myself listing more flaws than I'd expected. So, was it all hype? Or does it truly deserve all that praise? Let's take a closer look. Before we get into it, let's just make it crystal clear that providing analysis and critique of a story does not mean you hate it. I enjoy dissecting even my favorites to understand what exactly made me love them so much, and when taking a closer look reveals flaws which I had glossed over at first, it doesn't make me appreciate them any less. In this video, I'll highlight some aspects of these Archon quests which didn't work for me. If they worked for you, then I'm genuinely happy they did. I'm glad when people enjoy things, especially when it contrasts with my own experience, and I'd love to hear your take regardless of whether you agree or disagree with mine. We'll start with overall thoughts and then dive into some of the details. Expect full spoilers. I haven't yet been swept up by the lore of the overarching story in Genshin, as the progress is understandably quite slow, so the strength of my interest in each Archon quest depends on its arc in isolation and the characters within it. As you may have noticed if you've ever watched any of my character reviews, I'm always hoping for more content that better shows off the depth of Genshin's characters as well as their interactions with each other. This means that in many acts of the past Archon quests, my attention wandered and I skimmed through the story without really getting that invested in the events unfolding or the characters involved. Sumeru was where I really started to care. I'd love to say that Fontaine's Archon quests were the first arc where I skipped absolutely nothing, but that would be a lie. But at least this time it was close. Out of the 5 acts, 3 had me utterly hooked, and in those sections I didn't skip a single word. While I have some reservations in retrospect, aside from that section which bored me to tears, the experience absolutely lived up to the hype. The characters were a consistent high point, and some subtle improvements in writing and dialogue made them feel more nuanced and real to me than in previous Archon quests. For one thing, the focus was squarely on the playable characters this time around. In the earlier regions, I often felt that the playable characters took a backseat in the Archon quests, and characters like Tepe or Dunyazad were more central to the story. While it's arguable that this should not be considered a flaw, the gacha characters are presented with such fanfare that it feels jarring when the characters who grow and change throughout the quest are the bland-looking NPCs instead. On the other hand, it's natural for gacha characters to each be designed around the ideal representation of their intended personality, which is directly at odds with the idea of them truly being changed by the events we witness. In Fontaine, they managed to achieve a subtle balance on this point. With 1 or 2 exceptions, the characters' personalities remain unchanged by the story, but they're made to feel dynamic by giving us a flawed understanding at first and shifting our perspective on them over the course of the story. This change in approach also solved another critique I've often made of Genshin's characters in the past. While their backstories are fantastic, disappointingly little of that actually made it through into the quests. In Fontaine, character backstory became central to the events at hand, and the slow reveal of the characters' deaths over time made them feel so much more alive. And on top of that, the writing and dialogue also felt more nuanced, with much more subtext and depth. Hoyo seemed to trust that we would be able to follow what was happening and to understand the story written in between the lines. Even Paimon stopped spending all her time repeating the words characters had just said. My only real complaint from a high-level perspective is the pacing. Some sections felt a little rushed or glossed over, while others very much outstayed their welcome. The pacing issues reminded me of Brandon Sanderson's books from early on in his career, where everything came to head in one mind-bending final chapter in which everything is revealed and resolved all at once. It's an overwhelming experience in the moment, but it's not quite as satisfying as a more considered story structure can be, when the tension is reached and sustained over a longer period. In a nutshell, I wish they had half the length of Acts 3 and 4, or at least changed their focus and extended Act 5, especially the denouement. Let's look at each section of the story in sequence, and since I feel like each act puts the spotlight on 1 or 2 characters in particular, we'll touch on those 2 while we're at it. And yes, that means that we won't get to Furina and Neuvillette until the end. The first act was a wild ride, starting with a theatrical introduction to Fontaine's favourite Archon, followed by Lyney and Lynette's magic show being interrupted by the death of their assistant, after which it became a murder mystery and a courtroom drama as the Traveller and Navia worked together to uncover what actually happened in order to clear Lyney's name. I was hooked from start to finish. I liked all of the cast, with a notable exception of Furina. I hated her bratty attitude and her false accusations, though in spite of that, I felt that she had depth and subtlety, and expected that there would be more to her than we saw at first glance. I had high hopes that her story would make me love her by the end. The magic show setup was fun, and the investigation into the murder was engrossing, though the actual gameplay aspect of it sometimes felt a little bit hit and miss. This seems to be a common problem for me in Genshin's various figure out the answers gameplay loops. I don't enjoy trying to decrypt the awkwardly phrased questions, so I usually give up and just try all the options. It could be that something's getting lost in translation for these things, but either way, it just never works for me. The plot itself was really well done, and the conclusion felt satisfying, and overall, Fontaine was off to a fantastic start. Aside from being a brilliant self-contained story, the first act also set up a ton of questions which I really wanted to know the answer to. First off, the actual proof which the verdicts relied upon was bizarre and made the trials feel absolutely farcical. It felt like a commentary on the modern-day obsession with true crime and how what should be a serious process run by solemn institutions is turned into a voyeuristic pleasure for the masses. The oratrice itself chimes uncomfortably with how public perception is central to so much of the world. Too many things are just a popularity contest, lacking nuance and depth, focusing on all the wrong issues and doling out life-altering consequences based on arguments which range from awkward to downright stupid. This all added to a sense of unease about the entirety of Fontaine. Is this really the land of justice? There were so many clearly false accusations and spurious claims. Is that because justice itself is flawed, or is our perception of the events just incorrect? And of course, there were all the more obvious questions. What's up with the dissolving people? Or the mysterious case of disappearing women? Or Navia's father? What's going on with Furina? And what about the ominous prophecy, which all the people of Fontaine seem to just accept is going to happen? So many enticing questions, exactly what you'd want from an opening chapter. While this act naturally spent a lot of time introducing us to various people, it felt like the central focus was on Lyney and to a lesser extent Lynette. I liked Lynette instantly. I had loved her design in the reveal trailer and was looking forward to meeting her. She didn't disappoint. Her deadpan tone and reserved personality felt like a departure from what I'd come to expect and made her resigned acceptance that the entire nation was going to die feel much more ominous. Lynette faded into the background a bit throughout the rest of the story as Lyney took center stage. I had originally been unsure about him, but grew to appreciate his personality pretty quickly, particularly the contrast between the friendly and light-hearted facade he hides behind and his more private and reserved inner self. In terms of appearances, I still think he's a bit weird, but I shall forever defend him against the slutty magician police. Let him wear his poorly tailored suspenders to his heart's content. The one thing I'm unsure about when it comes to these two is whether the reveal that they're Fatui was supposed to be a surprise. They're the first Fatui who have been really painted as truly sympathetic characters, and the first playables who aren't harbingers. This point is treated as a surprise reveal to the Traveller during Lyney's trial, but since I knew the aspect of their backstory all along, it felt underwhelming. In later acts their affiliation comes up a little bit every now and then, but it still felt a little underused. Aside from that, they were both great, despite not being top tier favourites for me, though their backstory wasn't explored quite as much as some of the others in the later acts. The second act continued the murder mystery theme, but this time involving the cold case of a serial killer who had been preying on young women for decades, coupled with the story of Navia's father's death and disgrace. The story weaves together character intrigue and hidden motivations with important world building and steady reveal of Navia's tragic backstory, and everything comes together in a satisfying conclusion. Once again, I was absolutely hooked. It's hard for the middle parts of a story to succeed. For them to work, each one needs to strike a balance between maintaining a sense of progression in the overarching plot and building its own unique art in the narrative with its own satisfying conclusion. Act 2 did a great job at this, deftly tying together several different threads into a satisfying conclusion with a twist that brings even more questions than it answers. One detail which I really appreciated was that when the group split up to tackle things from different angles, we actually got to experience both perspectives. It's been long enough since I played the previous Archon Quest that I'm not entirely certain whether it's something completely new in Fontaine, but it felt unusual and it was a great inclusion. If it's new, then it's a great addition, and even if it's not, then I'm pretty sure this was the most effective use of that option up until this point. There's an interesting world-building thread which became really noticeable in this act, which feels like it has a lot of setup, but in retrospect just vanishes without a trace. Fontaine's populace has a glaring divide between the rich and the poor. A large portion of the people live either in the gorgeous retro-futuristic city or in picturesque farmhouses in stunning landscapes. They wear elaborate and beautiful clothing, indulge in entertainment at the opera and fine dining in classy restaurants and expensive hotels, and benefit from complex technology and spectacular infrastructure. They have a strong judiciary and a well-equipped military with a visible presence. A different section of the population literally live in the sewers. Their homes are cobbled together from sheets of old metal or even just canvas strung across any available space. Their clothes are more down to earth, evocative of working class stereotypes. Their leadership, the Spina di Rusula, are presented with mafia-style overtones and are implied to regularly be at odds with the guards. And that's before we even get to Meropide, a hidden fortress run by an exiled duke, where everyone spends all their time building war machines. I feel like these are hints that the story arc Hoyo planned for Fontaine once looked very different. Perhaps the Archon was supposed to be a tyrant, inventing spurious laws to entrap anyone suspected of dissent. Maybe the Spina were the core of an underground resistance, in direct conflict with the guards, and Meropide was a true fortress where the rebellion was preparing for war. This would match up a little better with some of the Fontaine lore included early on in the game, and may even be a better fit for some of the characters. It would have been a very bold direction to take, though I suppose they might have balked at the idea of the Archon being a true villain. On the whole, the alternate story sounds fascinating, but I'm not sure I trade it for what we get in the end. This act was, of course, absolutely carried by Navia. I feel like she didn't necessarily grow or change, but instead she feels incredibly dynamic due to the natural progression of her friendship with the Traveler and the steady reveal of her backstory and her place in the world. She was immediately lovable. She's at once both very feminine and princessy and a true leader. Often, characters like her end up being relegated to supporting roles, but she's loyal, confident, determined, and very much in charge. Even her sidekicks have way more personality and energy than I had expected. I also love that she showed such depth of emotion. Her passion when confronting Neuvillette made me really feel for her, while also feeling bad for him as well. The writing and acting in those scenes was absolutely fantastic. I can't wait to see more of her. Here's hoping that when Hoyo finally releases Cloran from wherever they've got her locked up, she can come with a story quest where she and Navia confront their shared wounds together and finally move on towards a brighter future. Acts 3 and 4 were unfortunately a massive disappointment. The trailer had made the prison section seem incredibly exciting, reminiscent of some of my favorite films and TV series. I was so ready for Genshin meets Shawshank Redemption meets Prison Break, with 10 scenes of the Traveler sneaking past patrols, talking their way out of trouble with the inmates, and uncovering the secrets of the mysterious underwater fortress. Instead, it was unbearably boring. The actual setup for the Traveler being convicted drained any tension from the plot, though I did love that everyone was appalled that Paimon ate Furina's cake and said it was tantamount to trying to assassinate her. The time spent in prison devolved into an endless grind, collecting a meaningless currency through pointless fetch quests and bland talking points. All the things I hate the most, one after the other, for what seemed like an eternity. These two supposedly separate acts didn't really have their own identity, so I tend to think of them as just one big mess. The actual story behind it was okay enough, but could have been told in a third of the time or less without losing any of the detail. All that would have been lost would be empty filler, and it would have been a dramatic improvement. It's interesting to compare this to the second act, which had done such a great job of balancing progression in the overarching plot with its own unique arc. Acts 3 and 4 felt like a very long side quest with little movement in the overarching plot, and their internal story was a disappointment. It was particularly bizarre to spend a bunch of time investigating stuff for Wriothesley, only to find out that he already knew everything all along. Talk about a waste of time. Thankfully, the ending of Act 4 managed to pull a magic magic trick worthy of Lyney, as it delivered an exciting climax with some tension and drama, and built back some of the momentum which had been lost in the overall story. Putting aside the narrative itself for a moment, absolutely nothing about Meropide makes any sense. Just what the heck even is this place, because it sure doesn't work like any prison I've ever heard of. It's quite bizarre that in the end it turns out to be just a fairly chill mecha factory populated with exiled laborers who seem to be fairly happy with their life there. You could argue that they're all institutionalized, but if that's what they were aiming for, then it was a big miss for me, and it absolutely does not mesh with how it was presented in the world outside. None of the inmates seem to be particularly dangerous, they're sure to follow all the rules, and they're mostly happy to help the new fish. It would have been interesting to see some actual tension and politics among the inmates, or perhaps some reference to the bizarre laws in Fontaine which led to such normal people being imprisoned. Or maybe it could have been blamed on the inequality which is clearly rampant in this society. Even just an explanation of what led to this super weird state of things would have been quite welcome. I'm sure it's covered in the law somewhere, or even in the reams of conversations which I struggled to focus on, but it's quite odd that Traveler and Paimon just found it all totally normal and didn't think to wonder. As I mentioned earlier, it really does feel like a holdover from some previous iteration of the story, which had been changed too late in the development cycle to fit the final version we actually got. These acts would have been about learning the history of the rebellion and slowly ratcheting up the tensions as the entire nation built towards a civil war. I love the vibes of the place, but after the torture of Act 3, I'll gladly avoid returning. I think another reason that this section felt a little disjointed is that unlike the other 3 acts, it didn't have a playable character at its center, ignoring the Traveler of course. I had expected it to focus on Wriothesley, but he felt very much like a background character here, as did Sigewinne. Compared to the previous 2 acts, it felt much more like the Archon Quests of old. That contrast really drove home to me exactly why those first 2 sections worked so well. I wish Hoyo had carried on with that pattern. The 3rd act could have been all about the Traveler trying to uncover the truth about Wriothesley and maybe Meropide as a whole, and then the 4th could have woven in some more about Sigewinne or maybe Cloran to keep things interesting. Without that emotional core to each act, they just felt completely flat for me. On a more positive note, the scenes at the beginning and end of Act 4 are great examples of one big improvement throughout the Fontaine quests. The cinematography was noticeably more dynamic. In previous quests, many conversations had the most basic setup possible, with a single static camera angle pointed at each character and the focus switching between them to show whoever was speaking. In Fontaine, all of a sudden we got movement, shots focused on the surroundings, unique angles, positioning and focus, all in sync with the flow of the scene to provide a rhythm which actually complemented the conversation, emphasized the emotions involved, and made for a much more engaging experience. This is particularly noticeable in the scenes where characters were just sitting around discussing things, such as the reserved yet tense conversation between Furina and Arukino. I remember previous quests attempting this to some extent, but still feeling fairly static and uninspired, whereas in Fontaine it felt well done. One has to wonder whether the people at Hoyo involved in this were given access to the Roses and Muskets camera work minigame before Fontaine. It was kind of hilarious seeing these principles and ideas explicitly explored in an in-game event shortly after the quality and consistency of the application skyrocketed in the Archon quests. And then came the finale. The trailer made the story look fantastic, but the disappointment of Meropide was fresh in my mind. I was at once excited and apprehensive. I somehow managed to avoid all spoilers and streamed it on the final Sunday before the next patch dropped, a full 6 weeks after most people had experienced it. Just like the first 2 acts, I loved almost every minute of it. This act was squarely centered around the apocalyptic flood prophecy to drown the entirety of Fontaine, leaving the Hydro Archon alone, crying on her throne. The opening sequence did a fantastic job of bringing the characters from all sides together as they planned to confront Furina and force her hand in a desperate hope to find a way to prevent the prophecy from coming to pass. That moment where Furina appears almost ready to confess everything to the traveler was especially poignant. The writers did a fantastic job of making us feel for both sides at the same time. The trial that followed was tense and dramatic as the characters slowly came to realize that their actions were exactly what the prophecy foretold. Furina continued to refuse to cooperate to the point where she would prefer to die than admit that she was merely human. Despite her bravery and self-sacrifice, the trial reveals that she's no Archon, and she believes she has failed her one task at the last possible moment after 500 soul-crushing years. The flashback sequence was phenomenal, putting every detail of Furina's behavior into context and transforming her into one of the most tragic characters in the game. The use of metaphor was fantastic. Furina's entire world was a stage, and she went through the motions alone, forever trapped beneath the glare of the spotlights. The finale which followed was heartbreaking, a fitting ending to a fantastic region. This act was brilliant, but it was not flawless. Most of my complaints are comparatively minor. I again disliked the mystery-solving association gameplay and would have preferred for the whole thing to just have been essentially an interactive movie without those sections. Child still felt out of place in the story, and the narwhal felt very tacked on somehow. Plus, despite being visually stunning, its fight was a disappointment. The part which really bothered me though was what came after the ending. Furina was the soul of this story. We delved into her past, saw her iron will in the face of unending torture, and saw her fall apart in the moment when all hope was lost. And then, afterwards, barely an acknowledgement from Focalors in an unvoiced line of text, and a single scene of her walking outside to find that her people had survived. I wish they had spent a little more time on this. The period of time between the climax of the story and the end of the text is called the denouement, and it's supposed to pull together the remaining strands of the narrative and give closure to the reader and the characters. I feel like we didn't really get one for Furina, and as a result, the story seemed like it abruptly ended before its time. She spent lifetimes isolated and alone, talking to nobody. Now that she can finally be herself and connect with people, we don't even see a single conversation with her, or anyone thanking her for what she did. Instead, we get half an hour of info dumps from Skirk and Neuvillette, and oddly inconsequential chats with Charlotte and the others. Maybe with Furina's second story quest we'll get a proper ending. Looking back at her throughout the Archon Quest and ignoring the lack of true ending, I'm glad to say that my initial feelings of dislike for her are long gone, and my suspicion that she would become a favorite in the end was spot on. It's interesting to look back and compare to previous Archons and how they had been kept off stage until much later on in their stories. It was refreshing to see that she showed up right at the start. She was bratty and obnoxious and seemed to care more about spectacle despite being the god of justice, but even from the first moments it was made clear that more was going on beneath the surface. Fantastic foreshadowing which made me really wish I could go back and replay the entire sequence of quests to see how her behavior comes across now that I know what's actually behind the facade. The sequence where we finally understand both why she chose that specific over-the-top persona and who she really is underneath was absolutely brilliant. Probably my favorite detail from the story was that at first we didn't know whether she was going to take the leap of faith, trust the traveler and reveal all her secrets to them. At the time, I desperately wanted her to place her trust in them since it was clear by then that she was incredibly isolated and alone, and it felt like horrible timing that the conversation was interrupted at that exact moment. And then to understand what she had been tasked to do, to see her isolation wear away at her tragic moment where she was crying and didn't even realize it, and then see that she would have not taken the risk and instead would have held strong in her resolve, even to the last. Absolutely brilliant storytelling. The only thing missing from her story is those final few scenes, maybe showing the moment she learned that she didn't fail, or Focalors appearing before her to tell her that she had made her proud, or the other characters apologizing to her and welcoming her home. And that leads us to probably my favorite character from Fontaine, Neuvillette. For me, he felt like the emotional core of the story. He's such a steady presence from start to finish, and while he always came across as calm and considered, I always felt that he had a deep pool of emotion within him. The main change in him is that first, he was unsure of his place in the world, confused as to why Furina had asked him to take on the role of Udex, and slightly aloof from the others as a result, despite his best efforts. At the climax, he understands the reason behind all this, and his first act after regaining his power as Dragon Sovereign is to forgive the people of Fontaine for their sins and save them all. His stoicism throughout the story provided a stark contrast to the deep emotion he showed at the end, which really enhanced the impact of the final scene. Fosulos herself isn't really someone we have a connection to, since up until that point she had been completely absent from the story. Neuvillette provides a lens through which we view her sacrifice, and his tears are one of the reasons that scene is so wonderfully moving. I'm excited to see where they take this character in future, since his newfound position in the world is a big departure from the state of things for millennia. And finally, it's worth mentioning the Traveler and Paimon. I thought it was interesting, both in these Archon quests and in Fontaine in general, how little they actually affected the course of events. Instead, they seemed more observers than instigators, and even at the end, they for once don't have the full picture. Neuvillette was the one who talked to Fosulos in the end. It's rare for a video game with a singular protagonist to take this approach, but I think that for a gacha game, it's pretty inspired. It gives the other characters more agency and depth, and fosters a much stronger feeling that Tevat exists independently of the Traveler's story. For once, Paimon spent all her screen time being her own self, and little to none just echoing everything everyone else had just said. This was a welcome change, which made her feel much more involved in the narrative, and allowed plot significant details to be added in more subtly over the course of the story. Also, Detective Paimon is a style icon. So with all that said, let's look into the future. For the rest of Fontaine, I'm hoping for lower stakes stories where we get to see the characters interact with one another, deal with more relatable problems, and just live their lives. I love the Roses and Muskets event. It's a perfect example of this, and while I know some people wished for a more high stakes story, for me it was the perfect balance and had one of my favorite storylines in the game. More of the same, please. Looking further out towards Natlan, I hope Hoyo will continue their streak of amazing stories, continue to trust the audience more and spoon-feed less while getting a better handle on pacing. I'd also love to see a true antagonist, someone who isn't just pure evil, but is simply at odds with everything the Traveler and their allies are planning, and who isn't either retconned or rewritten to be sympathetic to our protagonists. I'd find that much more compelling than what we've seen from characters who fill those roles so far. For me, despite its flaws, Fontaine's story had that indefinable magic which can sweep you away into another world and put you through a whole rollercoaster of emotions and still leave you wanting more. I understand those people for whom the flaws were too big a problem for them to enjoy the story, but for me it absolutely deserved all the praise and lived up to its promise overall. For those of you who made it this far, thank you for listening to me ramble. As I said at the start, I'd love to hear your thoughts, even if they're completely at odds with my own experience. So let's have a conversation in the comments down below. Until next time!